Opportunity. Thanks for those very kind words. We're going to be dividing the paper between us and then both answering questions towards the end of it. Thanks very much.
Right. So we want to set the stage with a little bit of context first. So I'll kind of start with the Me Too. If you've had any sort of presence in social media, if you don't live under a rock, then undoubtedly you will have heard about the Me Too movement. So it started in 2007 with an activist named Tarana Burke, and it became part of the cultural zeitgeist this year when actress Alyssa Milano used the hashtag to encourage women to share their own stories in reaction to the tales of sexual abuse, sexual assault, and sexual harassment perpetuated by Harvey Weinstein and others in the TV and film industry. Instantly it seemed to grow into something larger, with women coming forward across all walks of life to share stories that they too had been victims of sexual abuse in its varying and horrifying forms. And in the first 24 hours, the hashtag MeToo had been shared more than 100,000 times on Twitter and by 4.7 million people in 12 million different posts on Facebook. And that's in the first 24 hours. So, setting the context here a little bit, the World Health Organization's statistics on violence against women says that it's a major public health problem and a violation of women's rights. They note that 1 in 3 women, 35% worldwide, have experienced either physical and/or sexual intimate partner violence or non-partner sexual violence in their lifetime. 1 in 3 women worldwide. And most of this violence is intimate partner violence. Worldwide, almost a third of women who have been in a relationship report that they've experienced some form of physical or sexual violence by their intimate partner. Rape Crisis England and Wales, in their statistics that were released last year, report that approximately 85,000 women and 12,000 men are raped, and that includes attempted rape, in England and Wales each year. And that's roughly 11 rapes of adults alone every hour, and those are the ones we know about. Nearly 500,000 adults are sexually assaulted in England and Wales each year. 500,000. 1 in 5 women between the ages of 16 and 59 have experienced some form of sexual violence since the age of 16. So significant statistics, it is there, it is part of the reality that people, or women especially, but people are having to deal with. While a lot of the active voices in the Me Too movement are based in the States, the reality is that social media has taken it up and it has become part of the wider social conversation. So Time magazine appointed the People of the Year as being the silence breakers, or those who were part of the Me Too movement, which was in October 2017. And the movement has spread across industries and disciplines, with women and, to be fair, some men coming forward to tell their stories of sexual abuse and assault. From a new action plan called Time's Up that focuses on setting up a legal defense to support those who are working in working class sector, janitors, nurses, hospitality industry, farm and factory workers, to protect themselves after they have reported abuse. Because one of the reasons why a report doesn't happen is because they're afraid they're going to lose their job. It also extends to seeing reverberations around the academy, with an increase in reports from both faculty and students of sexual harassment in educational institutions. And then even to the church, with 2 specific hashtags that have been used, Church Too and Silence is Not Spiritual. So Church Too started on Twitter in response to Me Too, and has served to link the Me Too movement to the stories of abuse in the church, and not just in the church, but other religious communities as well. So there has been an interfaith dimension to that. With women primarily telling stories of ways in which religious communities they are or were a part of have perpetuated violence against women. Examples here: stories of young women raped and assaulted by male religious leadership, and when they told someone about it, They, meaning the victims, were told to repent. Stories of women in relationships marked by domestic violence and sexual abuse who were told that they should submit to their husbands or to their fathers or to the abusers, whoever they may be, because it's what God wants. Repeated stories of men who have publicly confessed to molestation, harassment, and assault and are praised for their bravery and honesty with no consequences. Another story from a woman entering into ministry, and for starting her internship, a man in the congregation complains to the senior pastor that he couldn't focus on the sermon when she preached because he couldn't sexualize her. Their solution was for the congregant to get her preaching schedule in advance so he could choose other services to attend without distraction. So, what's important about church too, and its evangelical counterpart, Silence is Not Spiritual, is that they're seeking to highlight the church's legacy of protecting abusers and the gendered ways in which these reports and confessions are being addressed, or not, as the case may be. The Silence is Not Spiritual statement, and it's silenceisnotspiritual.com, I think, or .org, reads as follows. For too long, the voices of women and girls who suffer violence has been marginalized, ignored, or silenced. The global church has been slow to speak up and take action until now. So more than 150 leaders from across the world are calling upon the global faith community to stop standing by and to start standing up for women and girls who experience violence. We are facing a defining moment as a church, a kairos moment, they say, or a window of opportunity to bring healing in the world and in the church. And in so doing, doing nothing is not acceptable. So Silence is Not Spiritual. We're calling on churches, particularly those in our stream of the Christian faith, evangelical churches, to end the silence and stop all participation in violence against women. The author Margaret Atwood has been quoted as saying that men are afraid women will laugh at them, and women are afraid men will kill them. The Me Too movement and its tributaries are reflective of a wider conversation that's taking this seriously and shows a rising awareness that women from all walks of life, every color, every creed, profession, ability, and class are affected and have stories to tell, and therefore our theologies need to follow suit. So in October 2017, one church made a public connection to the Me Too movement in their church sign. This church sign is from the Gustavus Adolphus Lutheran Church in New York City and makes an obvious connection to the Matthew 25 text and identifying Jesus in the Me Too story on a symbolic and theological level. Although we have their permission to use this photo, we don't really know the conversation that happened that led them to do this sign, and we don't know really what they had in mind. And perhaps different people of the church understood it in different ways. It would be reasonable to suspect that many would have understood the words in a theological way. Matthew 25 invites the reader to see how we treat others is also how we treat Christ. More specifically, Christ shares in whatever treatment is extended to the least or the most vulnerable among us, the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked. In the same vein, on a theological level, therefore, Christ can be identified with those who have endured sexual abuse. On a theological level, it's reasonable to make the connection that Christ has shared in their suffering and can, therefore, be understood as sharing in Me Too. Daniel Glaze, a progressive Baptist pastor in Richmond, Virginia, shared a sermon he preached recently saying, "Will we take advantage of those who are vulnerable in our midst? Or will we take seriously the call to care for Christ? For when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was being harassed, you spoke up and it was stopped." Acknowledging that Christ's shared suffering and sexual abuse at this theological level is important, and still surprisingly rare. However, whether it was intended by this particular church or not, the Me Too movement invites a more literal and historical understanding of Jesus' experience of sexual abuse. So I'll turn over to David.
part of it that I want to take forward, the more literal understanding beyond the symbolic theological association. Now, recognition of what I'm going to be exploring is very rare, despite what I would see of very strong biblical and textual evidence in support of it. And one of the mismatches, one of the problems to be explored, is why, at one level, the evidence for what I'll be suggesting seems so clear, and yet the prevalence of this view is still so restricted. At the International Society of Biblical Literature conference in July 1998, I offered a paper to illustrate how, as I saw it, the hermeneutical approach developed in Latin American liberation theology might be used for insights into crucifixion as a form of state terror and sexual abuse. The paper was well received, and it was published the following year in the Union Seminary Quarterly Review 1999 as Crucifixion, State Terror and Sexual Abuse. The article is now readily available, and the editors have very kindly said that I can share and circulate it as long as it's attributed. So some of you I know have had a chance to read that ahead of this seminar and even in class here. Some of you may have seen that there's a link from the Shiloh project to it, and that's available through the website. To briefly summarise the argument, it identified two elements of a contextual approach by investigating Latin American torture reports on the abuses of authoritarian regimes in Brazil, Argentina, Chile, El Salvador, and Guatemala in the 1970s and 1980s. And in these reports, it seemed to me, two patterns became very clear. First, torture operated as a form of state terror, which went beyond the immediate individual victim to threaten a much wider audience. In some cases, torture was in secret and hidden from the public gaze. It became known slowly and often through rumour. But incidents were so frequent that they gradually built up to a cumulative sense that came to dominate and terrorise the wider society, even though nobody knew for absolutely sure exactly what was happening. In other cases, especially in the counterinsurgency campaigns in Central America, which is where I was focusing my own work, torture and executions could be public, and in some cases involved visual spectacles that served as dramatic warnings to the wider society. The second pattern was that sexual abuse and sexual violence were very common in torture practices and could take extreme forms. Sexual abuses served the purposes of state terror as a physical and psychological weapon. Sexual violence was used to humiliate and demean prisoners in ways that destroyed them from the inside as well as from the outside. Now, drawing on these two patterns, the notion of state terror to a wider constituency and the prevalence of sexual violence within that, I then sought to apply that to how Romans used crucifixion as a so-called supreme punishment, one of the Roman terms for it. And I suggested, first, that there is evidence that the Romans used crucifixions in a similar way for state terror, to intimidate a subject people beyond the immediate victim. Second, there is evidence that the Romans stripped their victims and crucified them naked. There are references in ancient writings to the sexual violence of crucifixion, which suggest that Romans intentionally used sexual violence to punish, shame, and dehumanize their victims. However, it can be easy to miss this, or to see it, but to fail to appreciate its significance when we read the Gospels. In the coming year, Jayme and I hope to develop a Bible study which will allow this to be explored in more detail, drawing on Mark 15, 16 to 24. what we hope to do with this is to offer a biblical text, a short biblical text, just 9 verses, which is very familiar to people. It's part of the Easter stories. It's readily repeated in churches. To invite people to read it, and then to invite them to read it again very slowly. To think about what it is that stands out in this text when you do read it. And if you're invited to read it more than once, do you notice anything as you read it again? If you're familiar with the text, is there anything new that you see? If you're not familiar with the text, what jumps out? Then to ask, well, does the stripping jump out at you? And if it does, how many times does it happen? Is it once? Is it twice? Is it 3 times? We'll be suggesting that it is 3 times, but it's very easy to miss this. We'll be suggesting that you can see it happen when the purple robe is put on Jesus. It's then will happen again when the purple robe is taken off and his own clothes are put on. That tells you that he was stripped the first time. Then he's taken to be crucified. You lose track perhaps of the story slightly, other things happen, but then you read he is on the cross and his clothes are being divided. So in just a very compressed passage, 9 verses, Jesus is stripped 3 times. Easy to miss, or easy not to see the significance of that. So, bringing these points together, and in some ways what I've said so far is not particularly original or novel. It's not new for me to be saying the Romans used crucifixion as state terror. I think I've probably put emphasis on that in ways that others haven't, but I don't think that's a particularly original idea. Nor is it new for me to be saying that Jesus was stripped and crucified naked. Many people I speak to nod and say, yes, I'd heard that. That's not a shock or a surprise to me. So what is it? Well, what I'm trying to do is draw connections between a number of things here, and this is what I tried to do with the article. First, that the stripping was part of the mockery and humiliation involved in crucifixion. A clear and central element in the execution was to strip the victim and display him naked for the cross and on the cross. Second, and this is where I make an original contribution, I think, this humiliation needs to be named as sexual abuse, if its significance is to be understood and properly appreciated. The sexual abuse was not accidental or incidental to crucifixion as a form of torture and execution, but rather it was intentional and integral. The Romans knew what they were doing. Crucifixion should therefore be recognised as a form of sexual torture and sexual violence, and it's not anachronistic for us to use these words. It's precisely what the Romans were about. To quote from the article, which I know is a very inappropriate thing to do, so if you're trained in scholarly methods, please don't listen to this next bit and forgive me for this poor practice. Based on what the gospel texts themselves indicate, the sexual element in the abuse is unavoidable. An adult man was stripped naked for flogging, then dressed in an insulting way to be mocked, struck and spat at by a multitude of soldiers, before being stripped again and reclothed for his journey, only to be stripped again and displayed to die whilst naked to a mocking crowd. When the textual presentation is stated like this, the sexual element of the abuse becomes clear. The assertion is controversial only insofar as it seems startling in view of usual presentations. The sexual element of the torture is downplayed in artistic representations of the crucifixion that show Jesus wearing a loincloth. These images distance us from the biblical text, perhaps because the sexual element has been too disturbing to confront. Now, whilst our main focus this afternoon is going to be on naming the stripping as a form of sexual abuse, it should also be noted that stripping is often a prelude to other forms of sexual violence and abuse. Although it's impossible to say with certainty, it would not have been unusual if Jesus' crucifixion had been preceded by other forms of sexual violence. There are therefore further questions about what else might have happened, for example, as part of the mockery in the Praetorium. the article suggests that this possibility cannot be ruled out. Finally, it should also be added that in some Roman passages, a strong and very disturbing connection is made between Roman crucifixions and impalements. This is most obvious in two passages in Seneca, but it might also be hinted at in some of Josephus's writings. For example, Seneca writes in his letter to Marcia on consolation, "I see crosses there," he's talking about the campaign in Bithynia he had seen, "not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with head down towards the ground. Some impale their private parts. Others stretch out their arms on the gibbet." We're very familiar with the outstretched arms, but it is very, very unusual for people to look at how the cross might have impaled the genitals. Since first presenting the paper, I've been struck by an interesting dynamic in the reaction that it's often created. When people first hear the title and/or the suggestion that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, they are often surprised and perhaps sceptical. Some have been dismissive and quick to assure me that there is no biblical or historical evidence of this. Others have been more heated and suggested that it is inappropriate and irresponsible, even offensive and outrageous to suggest it. Some have questioned the motive behind it and suggested it's just an attempt to be politically correct and/or enjoy the notoriety of an extreme position at the expense of Christian faith. By contrast, people who have read the article or heard me speak have typically been very thoughtful and often appreciative. The issues are indeed disturbing, but they can't just be dismissed. The current public debates taking place on the prevalence of sexual harassment and sexual assault in society and in the church therefore provides a very interesting context in which to revisit the acknowledgement of Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse nearly 20 years since the paper first came out. For some, no doubt the simplistic reaction is just to dismiss the discussion. When Sibs promoted this lecture on Twitter, it prompted a tweet from the US. Some of you might even have seen it, perhaps. Usually tweets can't develop much of a sustained argument, but this particular tweet I thought did an impressive job in communicating 3 different arguments in a very short and compressed space. There is zero biblical or historical evidence of Jesus being a victim of sexual abuse. This is insulting and demeaning to all Christians. Instead of trying to feminize Christ, why not highlight his efforts to foster a lasting role for the church? So, 3 points here, I think. First, there's the issue of historical evidence. Second, that it's insulting and demeaning to all Christians. Third, that it's an effort to feminize Christ. On the first point, I would argue and maintain there is in fact plenty of historical evidence that crucifixion and other ancient punishments were readily sexualized, and that the gospel texts provide explicit evidence of this in relation to stripping. The Gospels alone are very clear on this, I think. Now, there's a great deal more that might be said about this, but I'll leave that for another time and place. What seems to me to be behind the second objection is where I want to focus more of my attention. What this one seems to be assuming is that it's inherently insulting and demeaning to suggest that someone might have experienced sexual abuse. The clear implication is that if Jesus experienced sexual abuse, he is somehow less worthy, perhaps because he is less pure, or less innocent, or less virtuous, or less something, than if he had not, and I'll return to this below. To what extent the negative views of the second objection are then linked to the third objection, that sexual abuse feminizes Christ, is not completely clear. I think there's a decent possibility that Jesus is less of a man because of the sexual abuse, and that's the link to the feminization. This too raises lots of questions that we can set aside and revisit at Q&A. And we might talk about the Christa tradition and Christian art as part of this. But in this next section, I'm going to speak about, well, why does it matter to do this sort of work, to name Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse? And in this, I hope to respond to this second objection made in the tweet, that it's insulting and demeaning. For many who have heard about the article, or some variant of the presentation over the years, there is an open-minded attitude, but still a question of what purpose this research really serves. Why does it matter? What purpose does it serve to open up this painful and disturbing history? Sometimes at a personal level, why, David, have you been doing this? As noted in the discussion of the tweet, some people assume that a person who has suffered sexual abuse is thereby devalued and less worthy. Indeed, in many cases, they are seen as worth less. In more serious cases, this negative attitude means that women who have been raped in conflicts are often abandoned by their husband or partner and by the wider family and community. So just to contextualise that remark a bit, I should perhaps say I've been doing quite a lot of reading of reports from conflict-related conflict situations covering conflict-related sexual violence. And one of the things I've been exploring is the treatment usually of women victims after they've been exposed to conflict rapes. And in many, many cases, they'll be rejected by their partner, by their family, by the wider community. The church will not necessarily reject them, but nor will it embrace them either. There will be then a further complicated dynamic in the church. So some of my thinking of this has not been so much influenced by the context in the UK or in New Zealand where I now work, but in a more global context where some of the experiences of sexual violence can be very, very extreme, and some of then the reactions to particularly women who have experienced sexual violence can also be very extreme. Now, many people will deny that they blame the victims, but it becomes clear that in practice, even if they do not blame the victims, they do readily stigmatise them and judge them in negative ways. Hence, the suggestion that Jesus experienced sexual abuse is to be fiercely resisted in their minds, as this would lower him in their eyes. This is especially relevant in the churches, I think. Respectable church people will invariably insist that they follow Christian teaching. They care for their neighbours, and they extend compassion to the needy and the hurting. Yet, a negative attitude to survivors of sexual violence remains close to the surface, and is often experienced by survivors who feel shunned and stigmatised by how they are treated. In some cases, survivors are the targets of gossip and rumours. In other cases, the negative attitude comes out through a silence. If the church never speaks of sexual violence or acknowledges those who have suffered from it, in a context where many in that congregation have suffered sexual violence in often very extreme ways, it can seem that the church does not want to know about it, and that the experience of survivors is unimportant, and therefore the church does not want to know about them. Likewise, if the experience of survivors is never addressed in church, it is easy for survivors to take that as a message that there is something wrong with them. Either what they did, i.e. victim blaming, or what they have become, i.e. victim stigmatising, or both, makes them unworthy in the eyes of respectable church members. As noted above, this negative view does not need to be explicitly articulated to be effective, and it's probably unusual for it to be explicitly articulated precisely because it does go against the expectations of respectable Christianity in terms of caring for others. Although in some cases it may be expressed in a very callous way, more usually it's disguised by a veneer of Christian respectability. But it remains close to the surface and leaves survivors lonely and isolated. What I think is especially interesting here is that the distinctive status of Jesus in Christianity strongly resists this dynamic. The easy default option of blaming the victim does not exist in the case of Jesus. Jesus is the one person who is seen to be blameless within many churches. Likewise, Jesus cannot be politely ignored, overlooked, or excluded as someone less worthy. Hence the suggestion that Jesus experienced sexual abuse is so disruptive and disconcerting to the notionally respectable Christian view. It challenges the prejudice that a victim of sexual abuse is somehow at fault and or irredeemably defiled by their experience. Hence, naming Jesus as a victim matters because it presents a very powerful resource for challenging dynamics in the churches that churches don't want to face and are often typically unaware of, and protest that they actually feel something different. So what we've tried to do this afternoon is to link the recent public focus on sexual assault, sexual abuse and sexual violence with the strained silence in the Christian tradition on Jesus as a victim of state-sponsored sexual abuse. This has meant going back to the biblical and historical sources that point very firmly in this direction, even though it's easy to miss these. We've also argued that this is not just a question of past history. This is not just a matter of getting the biblical scholarship right, important as that is. It's also profoundly relevant to the current day because it can make a real contribution to social norms and attitudes in Christian societies, especially within the churches. Many within the churches would claim that they do not stigmatise or judge those who have experienced sexual abuse. They would genuinely feel that they act out of compassion and love and would not mean to insult or demean victims of sexual abuse. Yet in many cases, a strong residual stigma seems to lie close to the surface, but just out of sight, even of the people who hold it. The suggestion that Jesus experienced sexual violence helps bring these negative judgments to the surface, as it did, I think, in that tweet. It is only when these judgments come out in the open that they can be acknowledged, debated, and hopefully transformed. Thank you. We have plenty of time. I don't know if you wish to chair the Q&A. We're happy just to move into Q&A.
Yeah.
Katie?
After you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I want to say thank you to you both for presenting the issues you have done. I think it's really important. I believe that it's important for churches, congregations, members of churches to think about the current debate, and I think your insights can contribute to the discussion. I don't think it ought to be, I don't think it makes Jesus less worthy. I think it actually gives more meaning to Jesus and gives us some tools for engaging with the debate today. And I think anything you can do in terms of Bible study to help churches to get into this discussion has got to be a good thing. I'm a Methodist minister, by the way. I have for long thought that Jesus was tortured violently. We don't really get the full picture in what we read. We just get the surface. I don't know if you've read the book 12 Years a Slave and then seen the film. The book is extremely brutal in the way it portrays violence, but I think the film sanitizes it a bit because there's kind of a sense that people can't cope with violence Well, I think we don't do a service to people by making it look okay. I think Mel Gibson's film on crucifixion of Christ is probably the closest we've come to really seeing that what Jesus went through was severe torture. And a lot of people found that uncomfortable, but I think we need to recognise it. What's going on for so many prisoners in the world today contemporaneously, I think they're going through torture that we don't know much about, and that's not a good thing. I'm thankful to you for the way you've linked. I've been aware of your work for a number of years, and I've been grateful. I'm thankful for the way your work has linked with the current Me Too debate, and I think the way you did it, Jayme, by linking it to that sentence from Matthew 25, in as much as you did it to anyone, you did it to me too, is very powerful. So thank you. I'm going to take a lot of good resource from this seminar to my congregations. We'll definitely lead Bible studies and preach on this theme, but I want to encourage you to do more to help churches, particularly churches, to engage with this. We must do that. I don't think Jesus is made less worthy by portraying the violence that was done to him. I think that it actually makes him a very powerful tool in the life of the church to help to engage with the issues. So thank you. It's not a question, I'm just saying thank you.
Yeah, but thank you for raising so many issues in that. I don't know if you want to come back on it.
No, your comments about 12 Years a Slave. I think it's interesting the work you've done as well around James Cone's book on the cross and the lynching tree. Will tell the stories of cases of lynchings in the American South, which is where I'm from, where the men who were lynched and some of the women were sexually violated as part of the lynching process. And James Cone sort of makes a bit of that connection. And so I think there's something in you mentioning 12 Years a Slave and knowing James Cone's work and the experiences of people who have undergone that kind of violence, that there are connections that are really important, and we need to be talking about those in the church.
Thank you again. I thought that was fabulous as well. My name is Emma. I'm a PhD student here doing religion and rape culture. So this was just fantastic talking to you. What I thought was really important and really interesting, and not something that happens all the time, is the distinction you made between how easy it is to miss something, but also how easy it is to ignore it. I think that was really essential in terms of it was reading the extract from Mark, wasn't it? It was like really easy to miss that or to ignore it. I think that's what happens in contemporary rape culture as well. And I think in terms of the links between the Me Too movement and how on that Time magazine front they are called the silence breakers, and in some ways that's controversial as well. The implication being that there were no voices before that, and that there was silence before that, which is of course even just with Rose McGowan not true. So I suppose I was just interested to know, is that feature in your work a lot? Is that, or the idea of ignoring things and silence, and if that makes sense?
Absolutely. So Jayme and I met in Northern Ireland, where I lived and worked for 13 years. And one of the features of Northern Irish society is an ability to know and not know, yes, know, and yet still to be able to operate in a way where one doesn't really know. And this
it even has a phrase: "Whatever you say nothing." So talk, but don't say anything about it.
I read that as pantomime forgetfulness before, as in knowing and not knowing.
Knowing and not knowing, and that's partly because you know what it is you shouldn't know, and you can't completely not know it, but you can know enough to know that you don't, as it were, operationalise it. You don't act on that basis. I mean, it is. Stanley Cohen has done some amazing work around states of denial, so it sort of certainly relates to this exploration of how it is. We can all, in some ways, we all have to, in some ways, work with a level of denial. And so I suppose it's sensitivity to that way of thinking and appreciating, well, that is what's going on here. It's quite. It's not the case that we necessarily miss this. We may notice this. I mean, certainly, I think in that biblical passage, it's quite easy to miss the first stripping. It's impossible to miss the second stripping. I mean, that's laid out for you. You can't miss that. In fact, in some liturgical traditions, particularly the Catholic tradition, you have a station of the cross, which is for stripping. I mean, it's not that it's not known. It is there, but it is what significance is given to that. And then the third stripping in that passage is interesting. My own experience is many people say, yes, I know Jesus was naked, but I have never heard it called sexual abuse before. It's the framing of it. So that's a very long answer to your question or comment, I suppose, but it's informed by those sorts of dynamics, and particularly Stanley Cohen's work, I think, is really good on that.
Even I would even say popular culture. Is there any Game of Thrones fans here? So Cersei's walk from the Grand Cathedral, whatever the Sept, that walk of shame, naked, through. As a religious person, I'm watching that going, holy cow! I mean, this was Christ's experience walking to Golgotha, and yet how many people haven't made that connection, and how many people saw how that was depicted and didn't see it as a sexualized torture or a sexualized violence sort of thing. So we see it in popular culture. We talk about it. It's part, and yet we don't know it. We don't name it for what it is. We don't say, we don't give it the importance that it needs to be given. So if we're not seeing it in our biblical text, and we're seeing it in something that we're spending so much time on fandom and all these hours obsessing over this story that we see on our TVs, and we're not making that connection either, then my goodness, no wonder.
Yeah, my question is very much connected with that, because I was thinking about the work that I've been doing on crucifixion in popular culture, and looking at Margaret Miles talking about the way that nakedness is gendered, and the way that it functions, the way that we see nakedness. So male nakedness is different to women's nakedness, and so it's very, when you see, say, women rappers who've tried to take on the crucifixion, which has been very, very often used by black rappers as like a kind of hyper masculine glorification and kind of representation of suffering. And then when women rappers have used it, there's been a very, very significant and immediate response of, why are you glamorizing sexual violence? So there's an immediate recognition of this as sexual abuse and violence, and connecting it with BDSM when it's a woman's naked body there, but then when it's a male naked body there, it's a connection with sport and kind of like spiritual suffering that comes through the physical. And I wondered if you'd looked at that aspect of it, the kind of gendering of nakedness.
I haven't.
To some extent, through the Christa images. So what's interesting with the Christa images is often they will present the fully naked body. So a Christa image, for those who are not familiar with it, is a female figure on the cross, or a female crucifixion figure. And very often those will be fully naked, and very often they will be much more clearly suggestive of sexual violence and a sexual dimension to them. And the connection will be made in people's minds to part of the suffering is women who experience rape or other forms of sexual assault. So I think that that is a dynamic which is certainly happening, and I suspect that was the dynamic behind this third point in the tweet, that to acknowledge Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse is in some way associated with thinking of him as a woman, because of that association between that's women's experience. And I think in some ways the Romans would have had that in their mind as well. I mean, part of what they would have understood the insult and the demeaning to have been would have been to treat a man in the way that they would thought of as how you treat a woman. They would have made precisely that connection as a form of insult. I'm fascinated by what you said, because I haven't done any of the work in terms of how that's presented in rap by women or men. It would be interesting to look at that. But it's certainly there. I mean, I think it certainly exposes the obvious double standard in the way that we see women's bodies and we see men's bodies typically, or the way society generally does that, the dominant view. And I think that's probably an element in the resistance to acknowledging Jesus' body on the cross as naked in anything more than a token way. I mean, as I say, most people will acknowledge that was the case, but typically that's not the way that Jesus is pictured and represented.
I was just thinking, in the Gospels it's theologically quite important that Jesus goes to Golgotha voluntarily, and much is made of the fact that he knows, perhaps not exactly the details, because every Lent there's this discussion in churches, but it's like he knows what he's doing. And I was wondering how far you've considered the implications of that aspect of this for discussions around rape and sexual assault, where whether or not a case can be proved and argued is always, well, can we demonstrate that there was any voluntary, that whether the victim of the rape or the assault engaged voluntarily with the alleged perpetrator. And I was just wondering where you are with that.
It's an amazing question. And I need to think about that for a second. But I haven't worked on it specifically. What about you?
So to answer a slightly different question first and then come round to it, my strong feeling for some time has been, until we get the history right, until we get the sort of biblical text right, and obviously you can always say, well, to what extent is the biblical text right on the history, but assuming the biblical text is the starting point here, let's try to get that right before we start exploring the theology. Because the church has launched in with the theology. We all know, as it were, in terms of theologically, what the cross is about. But let's set that aside and see if we can get a clearer sense of what the cross was about historically first, because that might actually be severely disruptive for what we thought we knew about the theology, or thought we believed about the theology. So I think there's a huge issue here to start exploring about the theology, but we're not yet in a position to do that until there's a clearer sense about what the historical event of crucifixion was about. My own personal theological view would be extremely wary, and I think this research should make us more wary, that this was something that, two things, either that this was something that Jesus enthusiastically or even semi-reluctantly... No, fair enough, not though some variants of it might seem more enthusiastic. But okay, so we rule out enthusiastic. Voluntary, we could explore that more. I think this makes us very cautious about what we would want to say about this as voluntary suffering, but there will be different views on that. But the other thing I think we're going to need to be very cautious about is how much God is pulling the strings on this. How much this is a providential plan that God has scripted and Jesus is playing a part voluntarily, reluctantly, whatever it might be. I mean, I think all of those questions need to be part of a conversation that actually recognise what crucifixion was really like. In as much as we've sanitised what crucifixion is like, we haven't really had that conversation. It's been, even with Mel Gibson's appallingly brutal crucifixion, it's still a crucifixion that an heroic man might feel they could heroically undergo, the way it's constructed. A heroic man like Mel Gibson himself, he's comfortable with that sort of crucifixion. At SBL one year, they talked about Mel wanted a macho crucifixion. You know, that's what he wanted. It was to be macho. How he would resolve, how he would address the sexual abuse issues as fitting with his notion of a macho crucifixion is far from clear. But I think there's a whole theological discussion around atonement that follows on from this. It's absolutely important, and in fact, if anything, I think this focuses even more attention on the importance of resurrection. It's, we need to have a conversation about crucifixion in the light of another conversation around resurrection, but first a clearer sense of, well, what is this crucifixion thing? Hasn't really happened, it seems to me.
I would add maybe too that and this is included in the feminist critiques of atonement theories or theologies. God's role. So is what happened this sort of instance of divine child abuse, for lack of a better term, or when we look at it as Jesus submits himself to this violence for a larger good, is that then a model for ourselves to continue to submit ourselves, women primarily, but not always, to continue to submit yourself to the husband that beats you or to the father that continues to abuse you in order to preserve a higher good, the maintenance of the family, or to bring him to Jesus, or whatever the term might be. So while there's an element of voluntariness in the sense of Jesus saying no greater love as one who lays down his life for his friends, and that's interpreted sort of as a premonition or foreshadowing of the crucifixion. There's also the instance of him in the Garden of Gethsemane saying, take this cup from me, I don't want to do this. And so, I think that question is really interesting because, there is so much traditional theology that's based around the fact that he went willingly. How does it change our theology if we say, actually, maybe not? How do we think about the experience of the cross? What saves us if Jesus didn't go willingly? Or if you place the woman in an abusive situation in the place of Jesus, how do you read that story differently? How's your theology shaped by that? That's an important question. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you, Judith, for coming.
I just know very little about New Testament things in general, so this is just a general question. But isn't most consent narratives are based around you can consent to one thing and not another? So surely one of the answers could be that Jesus can consent to go somewhere without being sexually abused. Would that not be? It might not be, I don't know.
I want to hear from you. What do you?
I would say my question was about how that relates to the discourse we have around the validity of complaints about rape. You know.
Oh yeah. Yes.
So you know. So in fact, I don't know. It's even more troubling, or it continues to be deeply troubling, or it continues to feed into this narrative of sexual abuse being somehow different from other things that happen to someone, or that are done to someone. That if the sexual aspect, if the sexual abuse aspect of crucifixion is the one thing that Jesus couldn't consent to having been subjected to, but he could have consented to everything else. That feeds that sort of. We're back where we. So I think there's this huge problem. There's a huge taboo in our culture, probably most cultures, where that's just a question we have problems with. I think, and your point kind of demonstrates that. I've got no answers.
Yeah. And on that, I suppose my inclination would be that Jesus did not consent. I mean, I would be terribly wary to being crucified in the way that he was crucified. Now, what he might have consented to, what he might have been open to in terms of a decision to go to Jerusalem. That seems much more plausible, but the narrative, I suppose I'm picking up on the narrative of picking up your cross, of taking the way of the cross. I think if you have an understanding of what crucifixion actually was and what it was to the Romans, except people may have different views on this, but for me, I can't imagine that being consented to, and I think the sexual abuse reinforces that message. I mean, I've thought that before, but it would just reinforce. Meredith.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of tease out maybe a distinction between will and willingness and sort of inevitability, because I think the Synoptic Gospels are more about the inevitability of the crucifixion, whereas the Gospel of John is really focused on the will. And I think that might almost be an apology for what's going on in the Synoptics, that Jesus doesn't have control over what's going on. So I just wanted to make sure that we're sort of thinking about the Gospels as individual texts that have their own ideas about what's going on and consent and lack thereof.
There's also an issue around, this conversation is happening as part of the Me Too stuff, is what is consent? And the conversation about enthusiastic consent. And unless someone is saying yes, then no, it's
then
not
you get
consent.
The sort of ecstasy of suffering in later theology as well. It's
Exactly.
Yeah.
Just before coming to you, Emma, just to echo what Meredith is saying, my original article offered a kind of generic Gospels approach. It takes texts from wherever. More recently, Michael Traynor has written a book separately from my research, but has come to a very similar conclusion. But he has taken the Gospels one at a time. So he gives a chapter to each Gospel and follows those through. So, taking on board your point there, I think the book is called The Body of Jesus and Sexual Abuse, and it was published in 2014. Michael Traynor is a Catholic priest, so it is interesting for a Catholic priest, obviously informed by the clerical abuse scandal in Australia, to be offering that view. Sorry.
Again, just another question in terms of what was Jesus's alternative to going willingly? I suppose, in the sense of, I've just done some work about the Man of Sorrows in Lamentations as being the victim of rape, and I read that alongside Outlander. If anyone's seen that one,
I'm a huge Outlander fan.
Well,
we tell the world right now.
So in terms of the lead character there, submits to the most gruesome rape willingly, because the alternative is that death, and or his wife will be raped. So he, as you could say, it enthusiastically says, yes, do this to me so you don't do it to someone else. So, but the idea there being there is consent there, but still, I would argue, absolutely rape, because the alternative to their consent is death, or someone else's death, or someone else's rape. So in terms of this other question, what was Jesus's alternative to saying, to giving consent in that context? I genuinely don't know. And how would that inform his consent?
I suppose my resistance is the idea the way it is often framed, at least within churches, is this was something that at some level at least he wished to bring about in accordance with a divine providential plan. So there was a divine providential plan. He Jesus, submitted reluctantly but ultimately in agreement to that divine providential plan, and salvation was brought about that way. And I suppose my take on that is, can we not find a theology in which this was something that Jesus did not want to happen, rather than something that at some level he did want to happen? And I think we could at least have that conversation. And the reason for having that conversation, I think, is because it's really important not to put God on the side of the torturers. And I think that providential plan approach ultimately puts God on the side of torturers in the way that torturers will often say, we are using this to achieve some wider good. And the theological framework, which has God using the cross in that way as part of a divine plan, I find it really hard to see how you don't put God on the side of torturers that way, and in this case for sexual abusers as part of that torture. So if asked, well, how would you understand it? What meaning would you give to it? I would say that the meaning we have to place on it is on the cross as an absolute evil, and it is not something that anyone would willingly embrace. And therefore our theology then has to respond to that. How do we give meaning to that? We find meaning in resurrection coming from something that has been human evil at its very worst. Did God plan that? My answer to that is no. But I don't feel a need to believe that every single event and incident is planned by God. So that's not a problem for me at a theological level. I'm happy to say that the cross was what it was. We find theological meaning in the resurrection, not in the cross.
What you are bringing is bringing into sharper focus for me the whole issue of shame. The deep destructive power of shame. In sort of Western culture, we're not in a shame culture, whereas there are parts of the world where shame is almost the worst, most terrible thing that can happen. And obviously when the story of the crucifixion is presented in church, the word shame comes up from time to time. But what I'm really appreciating is the way that what you're doing is really focusing this notion of shame, what that experience in that culture, how destructive it is. And almost as we've been reflecting, I've been sort of physical pain, physical harm has a level, but for me shame goes deeper, psychological, to do with your identity. And I don't know, I just feel there's a whole area there that I want to understand more. Perhaps you can, just the psychological power and destructive energy of shame, and that brings to me another whole dimension of the atonement, which has perhaps just been on the edge. Yes, it's just I'm just grateful to really have been brought to a place of thinking about that in a whole fresh way. I just feel this is a whole dimension that we've, in my experience, has been hugely neglected, and yet obviously in the experience of people who experience sexual abuse, that's a hugely powerful factor. And I just make that observation, but also just what your own reflection on that would be. Because it's not an area of the crucifixion that I'd ever really seen anybody give as much focus to, which I now think ought to be the case.
Do you want to say anything?
No, you go ahead, because I know you've done work on shame.
So, I think it's right. I mean, I think shame is a profoundly important issue. It's more significant than we're perhaps aware in Western societies, but we have largely lost the language to really understand it, or it's been reduced to being ashamed, not a strong social dynamic of shame. It's interesting that people, it's not that unusual to see references to the shame of the cross, or crucifixion was deeply shameful. But I suppose my feeling is that this is largely lip service. People have not actually identified, but what exactly was the shame of the cross? There are some sort of fragments of evidence that suggests that the word crux in Latin was just too shameful a word to even speak. It was like a word that you would be reproved if spoken in public, especially if it was spoken in a sentence that was anywhere near a Roman citizen. It was all right perhaps to talk about slaves and those in the colonies and whatever, for them to be crucified, that was expected. But for the word cross to appear even in a sentence, even as a word, near a Roman citizen, that was unspeakable. That was too shameful to be spoken aloud. And I think what I'm saying, as will be obvious, is we need a more concrete understanding of what that shame is. It's one thing to think, well, it's shameful to be executed. Of course it is. That is a shameful thing. But the particular manner of this particular type of execution, what made crucifixion supremely shameful? What was that? And I think that's really important to understand. Well, what for the Romans, what was such a shameful thing? And they had a very thick understanding of this. They have very nuanced understandings of the politics of the body, particularly the politics of the body in public, and the shame and honour around that. There is now a movement to focus much more in biblical studies on honour and shame, and I think that's a good thing. I'm not completely familiar with that, but being more aware of those issues seems to me important.
So there's some New Testament people in the room, so you guys will absolutely know more about this than I do. But with the early church, something in my mind is saying that early depictions, frescoes, that kind of stuff in the catacombs, were all based on sort of the life of Jesus. The depictions of Jesus on the cross is a much later development, and I think it was, from what I remember, was connected to this element of shame. We don't want to depict the person for whom we are modeling our life and community on to be represented as this person who has undergone this shameful experience. And it was really sort of, somebody can date, but sort of 80, 100 years after Jesus died, at least, before he's depicted as being this figure on a cross.
About 900 something before you get the really firm,
right?
Which I was startled by. Yeah. When you think how dominant the cross is now. Yeah. Very, very late.
Yeah. Because Rita Nakashima Brock talks about that in, I think, Saving Empire is maybe the book, where you get these first depictions of Jesus on the cross, and it's connected to empire.
That's right.
Yeah. So.
The first example of what representation of Jesus on the cross that we know about is actually making fun of Jesus.
That's
so
right.
it's exactly the donkey's head that's just a graffito on the wall, and then after that there's a gemstone from, I believe, about the 3rd century, but other than that there's nothing.
So they're sort of external, aren't they, in that sense?
And they're all sort of, you guys are ridiculous, worshipping this crucified.
It's sort of kissing his hand towards, isn't it? So worshipping his God.
Exactly.
Alexamenos, I think, worships his God. Is the joke.
Yeah.
And if you look, I mean, it's very hard, that image. I don't know if people are familiar, but you'd find it on the internet fairly easily, I think. It is very hard because it is quite faded, but I certainly think you can view that image as a form of impalement. It would not be impossible to look at it that way, but it's very faded. It's very difficult to see exactly, and then it's further confused by the fact that he's wearing a donkey head, so that is also strange, and it's not completely clear where the skin that he would have been part of comes down to. But what I think that does tell us is the sense of the cross as dehumanizing. I mean, my reading of the donkey head is this is clearly a callous joke which is intended to dehumanize the victim on the cross.
Which would then imply to me as well that this idea that we are saved by Jesus on the cross, that this blood, shedding of blood in that experience is a fairly modern development. And so when we're talking about theology, we're talking about what saves us and whatever it is we need to be saved from and all those questions, that the crucifixion and that particular experience and death of Jesus is new.
And so it's just occurred to me what I was trying earlier to try and say in a very long-winded way could have just been much better said by we're saved by resurrection. We're not saved by crucifixion, we're saved by resurrection. That's
just the point you made earlier about like what is the nature of the shame of the cross? Like, do you think the idea of feminization is part of that? And we were just looking at that passage from Mark, and there was the King of the Jews before that symbol of like masculine identity is like snatched away. Do you not think that there is like a mention there of his masculinity, who is like labeled King of the Jews? Before then, that's like taken away. So do you think there is something there about feminization being part of the shame there?
I would certainly suspect that might be the case. I mean, I think setting this in the context of Roman understandings of sexuality and sexual activity, they have very clear senses of the male penetrator, the female penetrated. To be penetrated was to be understood in female terms. So my suspicion would be that one of the things that's going on there is a feminizing of the victim. That was part of what they saw as shameful and disgraceful.
This is not very developed, it's just something I'm just thinking about now. It's never stopped me before. I'm just thinking if we frame this in terms of sexual abuse and sexual violence, and then think about Jesus' silence at the trial, what does silence mean? And that becomes a very troubling silence in that framework, and especially thinking in terms of, #MeTooJesus. I'm just going to ask you now what you think of that.
I'm tempted to ask you what I should think of this, and then I most certainly will. So could you flesh it out a bit more? So his silence at the trial is troubling because...
Well, I'm just thinking about it being used as an example of dignified silence. So the idea that, in the face of potential violence, that's a kind of that's a model that's that's a model. That's a model we should go by. And I'm thinking if we're going to frame it in terms of silence in the face of kind of impending abuse or impending sexual violence, then that becomes really troubling. And
if
so
he's the model sufferer.
That's exactly what I mean.
Let me jump in then, and perhaps then for me, the challenge would be, how would one understand what it means to keep dignity in this context where you've got a pretty decent idea of where this is going, I suspect. So to reframe it slightly, in that context, how does one keep one's dignity as best one can? And I don't know. I think it would just be an enormously difficult and overwhelming task, and I think there is some suggestion that Jesus did find it overwhelming. And he succumbed to the view that he had. I think. My take on the cry from the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me? That was obviously that's a quotation from the Psalms, but it is also, I think, it rings true to how tortured people feel, that they do feel utterly abandoned and in the abyss, and keeping your dignity in that situation would be just enormously difficult. And who would we be to judge how somebody should be in that situation? I don't know. So
I suppose we have. That's what I find troubling about it, is that we have judged people in that situation, and especially judging people for speaking out. And we see this. We see this. I mean, we only have to have a little scroll down Twitter, and you can see people still being judged for speaking out. And why didn't they speak out? So the silence isn't. So simultaneously you've got silence as dignified, but you've also got silence as an indication of guilt or an indication of dishonesty. So I think you're dead right, except that we have, and I wonder if if Jesus is being used as a model for silence and for dignified silence, how that then plays out in terms of the Me Too context.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's troubling. And I can see that connection more clearly. I'm also aware in my own language I've been using the word "we" probably more than I should. Certainly when I said we're saved by resurrection, that was a very confessional statement in terms of thinking from within church and Christian theology. But yes, I think it raises that issue of silence, and I will need to think about that.
So I'm kind of sort of coming at it for two different sides. So how many people don't say anything because Jesus has been set up as the silent sufferer? This is, as a model, so you make that connection that you just said of, well, I need to just suffer in silence. We say that, right? And then the other side of it is Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse. If I say anything, they're not going to believe me anyway.
The inevitable.
Yeah. Or just I say who I am, they're not going to believe me in such a way that they're going to say, oh yeah, that's who you are. Of course we're not going to kill you. That doesn't happen when, there's something that's coming out within me too of men saying, I will believe you. When you tell your story, I will not question it. And so I think there's a connection there that somebody, whether it's us or somebody else, needs to flesh out of, was Jesus not saying anything because that's the model to how you're to respond? Or was Jesus not saying anything because it wouldn't have mattered anyway?
I wonder if, because the silent Jesus is like such a Markan thing, and I wonder if pairing that silence with John's really talky Jesus actually would help, because they both get the same ending, right? No matter what. So either you can be totally silent and get crucified, or you can confess the truth the entire time and take a long time doing it and be very thorough about it, and you still get crucified. So you kind of have two different models, and one tends to be emphasized as this dignified silence, but we actually have a different model as well that,
Fantastic point. I need to read those again in parallel and get my...
It's so interesting in the context of Me Too, because that was something where a woman's voice could in no situation be used in the correct way. Like, if you were silent, at a victim and silent, then why didn't you say something? If you were a victim and you said something, you were complicit with your previous silence, or you're not believed. If something didn't happen to you, but you were a bystander, you said something, like Emma Thompson, you're doing it for publicity. If you're a bystander, nothing happened to you, didn't say something, you're complicit, other people suffering.
If you're anonymous, you're not being open enough. If you are vague, you're not giving us enough details.
It's just, there was no correct way.
Absolutely, that's a fantastic point.
Which is funny because all the articles around Me Too, or a lot of articles around Me Too, we've come up with this rash of articles of men don't know what to do in offices anymore. And it's like, that's the worst thing that they get from this, is men don't know what to do in offices anymore. That's how focused coming out of this. It's ridiculous.
Or the response that's come out of from France of kind of, flirtation has died, or,
Yes.
I don't think what we're talking about here is flirtation. I think it's something different.
Yeah.
I think it'd be really interesting if you were to write something about the responses to your work in the context of rape culture.
Yeah.
I would love to read that.
I was just thinking, coming back to the theology, and in some traditions Jesus is the model, and there are many different ways of processing this. One of them would be that the incarnation is God identifying with the human condition, and so Jesus in the Passion takes this to extremes. So he identifies with people who are wrongly accused, he identifies with people who are betrayed, he identifies with people who are physically abused and who are killed and who have no voice. So the silence of Jesus when he doesn't defend himself is often interpreted as Jesus identifying with people who can't speak out and who aren't listened to, and who, which actually dovetails very nicely with Me Too. So there are different ways of that it's processed and used and discussed within different traditions.
And I think that format and that strand fits very well with the Matthew 25 strand. I mean, that's the identification of Jesus as Christ with those treated
But with John as well. Where he says, this isn't an accident, guys. I'm doing this on purpose. But yes, it's very problematic. And it's very uncomfortable.
Yep, I would like to pursue that in my own mind. It is, as you say, it really crystallises for challenge there, the Johannine strand.
Of course, you mentioned that you're developing a Bible study resource for churches. I was just wondering, especially in the UK, small churches now, the format is more and more all-age format, all-age worship. If you have small groups at home, the kids there with parents. Now, have you thought about the implications of that for discussing sexual abuse? And because it's just a vast subject, and some people go, it wouldn't just never be discussed if the children are around, and other people will say, well, the news is around when our children are around, and so this is part of their universe. And I was just wondering if you'd begun to even contemplate that.
I suppose one strand, or where we want to go with this coming year, at least 2018, is to focus on the stripping, which is the least confronting of the possibilities of sexual violence, which may be associated with crucifixion. Partly because that is the most clearly attested in the scripture. I mean, I think you can literally put your finger on the biblical text where that's clear. But another element of that is because it is the least confronting in terms of an opening up of this issue. It seems the obvious place to go first, and without making any sort of universal assumptions, it's not impossible that discussion could be had with quite a wide age group, not necessarily everybody and not in all situations, but not impossible. I mean, not least it is already there in the church tradition and the Station of the Cross and so on. And I think quite a wide age group could recognise as something really problematic. In fact, I think there are some stories of reading that passage, and it's for kids in the group who have recognised that this is problematic. The adults are adjusted to it; they know it's all part of the story and therefore okay. And it's the kids who say, "Hold on, what's going on there?" I mean, I suppose our thoughts with the Bible study would be, although that we don't have ownership of this idea in any way. There's no suggestion of that. It's an idea. In as much as there's a particular Bible study we want to offer, yes, it's going to be publicly available, but the obvious question would be, should this be facilitated by somebody who has experience and is comfortable with these issues and is good with groups and could cope with precisely that sort of question and know how to steer a conversation if kids are present and a conversation if not. And, you know, similar sensitivities around, you might have a different conversation if you've got people who identify personally with Me Too and people who don't identify immediately with Me Too. You might even have slightly different Bible studies around it for different groups. One of the other things we hope to do this year is also use this Bible study in Peru, which builds on previous research that the Centre of Otago did in 2016. We hope that will include survivors of sexual abuse, but we also hope it will include people who are not themselves survivors, but are thinking it through from a rather different perspective. And in both cases, using the Bible study needs to adapt to the people in the room.
I had, to be honest with you, I had not really thought about kind of intergenerational aspect of some of the churches here in the UK. But yeah, the pitfalls for me have been more around, what if there's a person who, you know, has experienced this, who is going to be in the room? How can we make sure the Bible study is going to be sensitive to, honors their experience, and doesn't re-traumatize or doesn't, you know, invite further pain, or out them as well, which would be, I think, something else that we would want to make sure to do. So, yeah.
And we're hoping that Bible study will appear on Jayme's website, so since that's on the board at the moment. That's where we hope we'd make some of the materials available for that, as well as the Otago website.
So a quick question. It's not particularly thought through, but I just thought kind of playing feedback off yours. Would it? I don't know whether it would be productive or very thoughtful, but could the text be essentially rewritten or reframed in a way that highlights all these issues of like sexual abuse and sexual assault in a way that it could help like victims of sexual assault? I don't really know how to phrase this, but in the sense it's text that they can identify with and then could be used in biblical studies and like examining this text in a different way. I don't really know how to
I think it's a good question. As I would see it, the sequence I'm most interested in at this point is if we are able to do more systematic and widespread work with different people, including survivors of sexual abuse, what do they say they find helpful or unhelpful in this biblical study and in this biblical text? I would like to think that it is helpful, and I know anecdotally at least some people have told me this idea and this way of thinking is very helpful for them, but there's been so far, I mean, this is the extraordinary thing, the idea has not really been given widespread currency so far, even though often people say, yes, it's so obvious when you think about it, and yet for whatever reason we haven't really thought about it. We haven't explored with survivors of sexual abuse whether they find this helpful or re-traumatizing or deeply disturbing or what they might think. But we can assume probably different people will think different things about it. There'll be no single answer. But the next step for me is to get a better sense of, well, what are those answers? Are there some things that might be done that make it more likely to be healing and constructive, and other things that could be done which are more likely to be disturbing and possibly even traumatic, and so on and so on. Once we've got that and done that sort of action research or further research, social research, we're then in a bit of a position, I think, to think through, well, where might we go from here? So, you know, one of the ideas, or one of the thoughts which has occurred to me is, how do the churches then perhaps think about institutionalizing this in their collective memory and their understanding? And I certainly wouldn't be suggesting that what we need is naked crucifixes everywhere and people having to look at this and be constantly reminded of this. I mean, that seems a terrible idea to me. I do think, though, we need to be more aware that the crucifixes we do see are not telling the whole story. They have had a covering up, and the covering up is probably a good thing. Even going back to Matthew 25, there's a sense, well, that's a good thing, but not covering up in a way that we forget what that reality was, and then get a distorted attitude to current survivors because of that amnesia. So, I mean, just one possibility might be that Good Friday morning, the early hours of Good Friday morning, are a time where the stripping is more explicitly remembered. So it's not something that we have to remember for every day of every hour of every week. It's something that is remembered briefly on the Good Friday morning in a symbolic way of remembering that this is part of the Good Friday story, and it shouldn't just be forgotten about completely. But it will be very difficult. I mean, this is a huge and very difficult area for the wider society. It's a huge and very difficult area for the church, because the church has not been very good with its understanding and its theology of the human body, and with abuse and all sorts of things which go into that. It's going to make it very hard. But it does have to happen. I mean, there have been some people in the church who've just told me, you can't say this. You know, it's just not something the church is going to be able to cope with. I just don't accept that. And of course, you know, they can't tell me what to do, but that is their view. This is stuff that shouldn't be said. And these are things that we don't really know, which will have to be worked out. But it should be possible to find some ways of addressing this issue, and potentially, again, going back to some of the contexts in which this has been explored, this is hugely healing for some people who hear this idea. I mean, that they are just amazed to hear this in a positive way, almost cannot believe that this is being suggested, because it is such good news for them. And I suppose that's the question. How do we ensure that this is good news in terms of theologically speaking, again from within the church context, how to ensure that this terrible news is in some ways good news? And that was the purpose of the title of this talk. Why does it matter? It matters because it can, we think, be good news, and it has that to offer.
Can I ask, have you shared this with groups of people who have been sexually abused?
Not as an intentional activity, but certainly.
Would that have some value?
Oh yes, no, that's where we want to go with this. So we've shared it in context where I would be pretty sure there have been people whose reaction has shown that they are survivors of sexual abuse. We would really like to work. I mean, it's obviously it needs to be done in a careful way, and there's all sorts of research ethics issues to explore and do well, but we're certainly hoping that we will do that work in Peru next year, and if there are opportunities to do it in other contexts as well, we'd certainly be very open to that. I mean, in some ways the Bible study itself is a very simple and straightforward and short, but it's how that's used and how the discussion it generates is then addressed.
I mean, I was wondering whether, sort of essentially, we would like your help, we would like your response. Can you help us? So what kind of things might you find be offensive? What kind of things you find really helpful? I would be really interested to know, the reactions to that.
So would we.
My suspicion is that it would be much more on the plus side, because you will be presenting it sensitively, and so. But just as you were talking, I was just thinking that, and that might help overcome when you send it out more generally to kind of be aware of where the danger areas or where the wording needs to be careful or something like that.
Okay, well, I feel like this could go on forever. Actually, I feel like we're never going to release you from this. Thank you so much. That was fabulous. It was really great. Just to say that David and Jayme are actually going to be interviewed, or your interview will be aired on BBC Radio Sheffield on Sunday morning. It's going to be between 7 and 9, but we don't know the exact time yet. But I think the producer's going to get in touch and tell me when the exact time is. So of course we'll tweet it and put it on Facebook, etc. But I'm sure everyone wants to hear more of you. So is there anything, so if you want to hear more about the research, do we keep in touch with your website, Jayme? Or?
Yeah, so it's JaymeReaves.com, my name is spelled differently, and /naked is the page where we're putting, so David's 99 article is there, And then when the resources are available, we'll put them there. When there are dates of where things are happening, we'll put those there too, I think. So yeah, at the moment, that's going to be the home for it, and then we'll see what happens, basically. And this is all a process.
If we get invites to blog at Shiloh, then
Yeah.
we'll blog
You've
at
got an
Shiloh.
open invitation.
Yeah.
Anytime.
Yeah.
So can we all just say thank you, and that was brilliant.
Cool.